Hi guys, Jason asked me for some clarification on UVs and how to use them in Maya and how the interface works. Let's start first off at a top level of what UVs even are. So here I have a picture of an orange, and imagine if you take this orange and you start peeling it out and you miraculously keep your orange peel in one solid piece. You then get out your set of paints and you start painting on this orange peel, and eventually you have a picture like this on the flattened orange peel. You then take that orange peel and you wrap it back around your orange, and you end up with a picture like this. That's basically what UVs are. They're trying to represent in 2D space a three-dimensional surface. And in Maya, we see this in most of the basic primitives in how they generate a default set of UVs. You can change this in their actual node hierarchy. If you go to the inputs, you can go to create UVs, none, normalization off, blah, 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 blah. Now, I would just leave it on the default settings, because when you get into detailed UV unwrapping, you actually have to start off with an existing node of UVs that exist. And that'll let you set parameters, and then when you unwrap, you're going to throw all that detail out, but you have to have that to begin with. So when you get this unwrap, you get a basic setup, and back in the day, this was how you did all unwrapping in 3D. You would just use this primitive idea of create UVs, planar, cylindrical, spherical, so on and so forth. And for the most part, many objects actually do okay with this. I use this for head mapping to this day, and usually get pretty far. You can then get this transform widget, which if you click on this little T, it brings up varying things. And this is trying to create a cylinder that matches your existing one. Shut up, cat. That's my cat. So for instance, if I scale this imaginary cylinder of UV space is different than the one that represents this one. And you can see how the caps of this cylinder don't even exist yet, because the UV unwrap doesn't know how to process that. So I might, back in the day, use this to get that, and then for these, select these edge loops, and create edit UVs, cut UV edges, and say basically this is a separate piece of orange that we're going to lay together. Now you'll notice you don't see anything happening, and that is because you have to highlight these edges. I wish this was turned on by default, but if you're in the UV texture editor, which you can get to in the Windows panel, Window UV texture editor, it's this button over here. Toggle the display of texture borders for the active mesh. And there they are. Again, we set a cylinder map, so that deleted that previous starting node of the cylinder's default UV unwrap and replaced it with this. And now it sees where those basically scissor cuts are for this UV. So why do we do these scissor cuts? Because now you can, to show you the old school way of doing this, if I selected all these faces, I'll just select all and then deselect these ones. If I had these ones selected now, I could then go create UVs automatic mapping, and they would be separate from there. But that doesn't get to the real point of this, which is how to unwrap UVs correctly. A lot of times using these basic object UV unwraps work well. However, let's talk about a more advanced scenario. So let's say I have something, this is going to be a hypothetical imaginary character, and I'm going to do this the hard way so you can see it from the start by even going to polycylinder and turning off starting UVs at all. So now we have no UVs, as you can see. So let's imagine this is a character, and we have it. This looks like a cylindrical torso plus head or neck in your imagination. But let's say we take these edges and we start, or these faces, and we extrude out an arm. And then we extrude out a forearm. Now this is the sort of thing that is not going to unwrap well. And if you imagine you're a taxidermist, you get a dead animal and you're unwrapping it, it wouldn't work there either. Sorry for the gruesome metaphor. So this is where what's normally referred to as pelt napping comes in. It's called pelt napping in in 3ds Max, and in Blender it's just called automatic napping. Again, Blender is, you know, in a lot of ways younger, and to its detriment it's younger, but in a lot of ways it's to its benefit. So Blender came around at the point where everybody saw this as the new feature and it just made it the default. So it doesn't have to deal with legacy stuff like this. So for this, I might be able to say, you know, this character head is, I'm just going to make a quick imaginary neck. So I might be able to say that this imaginary character neck is one part of this, and because I want this to be organic, I'm actually going to move this extra vert up. So when I map a head, imagine this is a head, again, it's quick modeling, I would actually not map this as a cylinder map where the whole top of the head gets cut off, but I would start laying out UV edges from here down to the bottom. And sure, I'll do one here. And here we're going to notice a problem. Edit Mesh, Cut UV Edges is not going to create anything. So if I go to the UV Texture Editor, nothing happened. And this is where that idea of starting nodes matters. Maya needs to have the existence of a UV map node to begin with so that you can eventually totally delete it with your own work, but it just needs it to start. So sure, we'll do this as a cylinder map. Who cares about any of this? I don't. Right now we're going to talk about doing the organic texture fixes. So now, because I have that, I can select this, and now I can say edit UVs, cut UV edges, and if I display that, you can see it. And because this is a character mesh where I might want it to unwrap all the way up here, I might select this edge loop and go G to do the same thing. And this arm is a problem. I'll click these ones. Again, I don't care what's going on in the UV editor. Right now, I'm just trying to get the correct seams. It doesn't really matter until we unwrap it. And all these ones created problem ones. So I'll get these. Say, edit UVs, so UV edges. Again, that's totally wrong right here. But we're not caring about that yet. We're just trying to get the right seams right now. So now I have this bottom seam for where the bottom of the character is. This top seam is where his torso might unwrap. And now I'm going to get his arm seams. You're trading off a few things when you unwrap. For one thing, you are dealing with texture space. So if I had all these UVs shrunken down into a very tiny space here on a 512 texture, that's a waste of texture space. I should be trying to maximize this texture space. But as a caveat, you also have to deal with seams. The more seams you add, the cleaner your unwrap is going to be. However, you're going to have to make those seams work when you texture. So getting textures to line up across seams is very difficult. Getting them to line up among connected faces is very easy. So you basically try to get, you try to not have too many seams because it creates problems that you then have to go and fix. And then lastly, you're dealing with distortion, which is sort of the opposite of texture seams. If you only unwrap, here I'll just show you really fast, edit UVs, so UV edges, and I go ahead a little bit, I don't have enough seams yet because this arm does not have a center seam. So if I go unwrap right now, you can see what happened to the arm. I've been around in 3D enough that I know that this is the section that the arm was. So if I select these, yeah, it's right there. And basically, it has no seam right here to unwrap it. So it stuck the faces that are in the middle, right in the middle, and is creating just a vortex where it doesn't have an ability to unwrap it as if it were an actual 2D paper mache project or origami project. So instead, I'm going to select these and create a seam. Actually, I'm going to do it right here. This is some long-term strategy for you guys to think about, but where you place seams matters a lot. As we talked about, more seams is bad and more distortion is bad. So one of the best things you can do when you're unwrapping is to place your seams in a place that no one's going to see them. So I would place them here because, or maybe even here, because nobody's going to see the underarm of this, ridiculous cylinder character, because most of the time his arms are going to be down at his side. So right now, if I go edit UVs, cut UVs, now you can start to see how it looks when I go to this button, which is the unfold selected UVs button. Oh, I gotta select all of these. So I'm just going to do all of these because then they're going to unwrap in the proper manner. By the way, that shortcut is Control F12. Control F9 through 12 converts selection to the different mode. So if you're in invert mode and then hit Control F10, it goes to edge mode. Control F10 to Control F12 goes to vert mode. Point is, now look at this unwrap. It's totally clean. And it's probably going, by unwrapping all of them at the same time, it's going to be mostly in the same distortion. At this point, it's good to add a texture to this so that you can have an idea of what you're looking at. So if I have this as a assign favorite material Lambert, go to its material attributes and set its color to just file. This is just a UV grid. If you Google search UV grid, there's tons of them out there. And we'll turn on textures. And I'm actually going to also use no light, or use flat lighting, which basically creates a material that self-illuminates and there's no lights in the scene and all lights and shadows are going to be ignored. And this is the best way to understand your texture. And here you can see some of the conundrums of texturing. So right now there's very little distortion. The UV space seems the same, so this square here seems about the same size as this square here. And sometimes that's what you want, sometimes it might not be. You might want smaller squares in the back or on the underside because no one's looking there. To continue with the character example, usually you reserve a lot more UV space for a character's face than you do for their body. But it looks okay. The next step is just using this as something that you bake a texture out to and then texture onto. And sometimes texturing is where you start having problems because you're going to have a lot of trouble getting this seam over here. However, let's assume here, if I baked a high-res texture out of this, it would end up being UV specific, or it would not have texture seams. And that's one of the main reasons I actually really like baking, is baking textures out means that the computer algorithm generates where geometries and pixels are supposed to go, and so it ends up being seamless automatically as long as you don't get too close. And that's one thing I might want to modify here. Is these textures, or these two UV spots, especially this one right here, on a pixel level, this might be too close to that, and therefore might start causing texture bleeding. That's a big subject to explain, but I'll get to it later. Anyways, Jason, I hope this helped you with some UV stuff, and let me show you a couple other examples of good UV layout. And I want to stress that, you know, don't be afraid to innovate on this. So if I go up to a different project, was I recording this whole time? Yes. So this is an example of an advanced character, and the UVs generally show that. So his head is an example of, again, this is in Blender, but same principles apply. His head is an example of where geometry matters and where I should split my seam. So if you look at where I put the seams, I'll turn normals off, and yeah, let's go back to so if you notice, I did end up putting a seam all the way along the top of his head, but only on the bottom part of his jaw. And actually it exists as a seam, but I ended up sewing it manually anyways. The top of his head is the part you're most likely to look at. So pardon me. The top of his head is the part you're most likely to look at, so that's the number one place I don't want to care about seams. And so there's no texture border there. When I get to the back of the head, I start adding some, and I even added some to help this unwrap. So this is almost like a half cylinder unwrap. And then this character does have lots of weird shit that needs special care. So around here I added an unwrap. So that these tusks could unwrap, I added a seam right here, and you'll notice once again I added it to the side that you're least likely to look at. So if there is a seam, you're not going to notice it. And then because his mouth is full of horrific alien gobbledygook, I added a seam so that the mouth could be a separate thing. Now his body actually represents a very different UV unwrapping thing. Normally you'd unwrap this like a normal character. You might say put a seam around the arm, put a seam down the back, put a seam around his thighs or around his waist, probably one right here to help the unwrap. And then when you get to the hand, you'd add again the seams I'm putting on the inside, and then you'd add one for the middle. But this guy has that Evangelion stuff going on where it's lots of separate plates, and I knew that that was going to be a major factor here. So if you look at his unwrap, it's very, very different. On one hand, each of the individual plates are just unwrapped willy-nilly. There's no sense of order here because the big plates on the front are one thing, and the sort of border edges are a different thing that need to be unwrapped. So, you know, if I select these, here you can see all the border edges. And I don't really care where they go. They're going to be small data. A lot of times I might even shrink them down to a single pixel. If they contrast as a texture seam, that's actually something for the better. So, there's lots and lots of different things out there. To show you another example of how we might go around doing this, let me look at my most recent file. So here I have my bonsai tree. This is the low poly version. You can see the high poly. Not a lot going on, but just enough detail that it'll bake out something of an interesting map. If I were to unwrap this table, this top part would probably be a major thing where I don't want to do pelt style unwrapping, because I want this to be a square that or a rectangle that goes vertically and horizontally around the UV map and has no distortion. If it starts to distort, you're going to have problems. And actually, pixels travel, left and right, and they blur a little bit that way. So actually, the more up and down, left and right you can be in your unwrapping, the better it is for texture distortion. So for this, I would probably just do a Mesh Tools, create Uvs Automatic Napping, and let's see how that works. It worked okay. It even kept these edges connected. So I'd probably be fine with that. This object is, where's my outliner? This object has many other mesh objects below it, but one of the ones that provides another example of an interesting UV choice is the table legs. So these 4 table legs, first off, I would unwrap one of them first, and then all 4 of them can share the same UVs. Why would I duplicate that? But another thing is, this is an example of where UV distortion can cause problems. This curve of the leg is beautiful to look at as model detail, but it's actually worse for normal or for UV detail. So for this, I might go create Uvs Automatic Napping. And let's look at how that looked in the UV texture editor. And you'll notice that it's following this curve. But if I want this to have that sense of, or if I'm texturing this, this curve is going to make it harder to take up space, and it's actually going to waste a lot of my time as well. So here I would actually go into edge mode, I'm actually going to add a seam, I think. Go to face mode and just double check that I don't have any faces here. To have faces right here or here would not only be a waste of geometry, but it's a waste of texture space and it's a waste of my time. So I'm actually going to now select this edge and go edit UVs, cut UV edges, and then in the UV texture editor, with all of these selected, Control 12 to convert my selection to UVs, I'm going to pelt unwrap this. It didn't work. Let's make sure we have display UV borders on, and we'll probably find a problem. Yep, there's a problem. All of these were border edges. So I need to make them not border edges so that it listens when I say only these specified ones via my user input are the ones that I want you to use. So I'll go down to Sew UV Edges. It's creating this ugly thing. Who cares? We'll fix it. So I'll select this, edit UVs, cut UV edges, select all, convert it to UVs, and now when I unwrap it, they're connected, which is going to be nice, but they're still pretty hideous. They're not what I think of as fancy UVs. And you guys have to ship your products. You have to ship your levels, so this is getting a little bit advanced. I don't think this is something that you guys necessarily have to go into this level of detail, but it's good to know about in case later on it does start to bug you, or you want to know some of the bigger theory behind it. So I will go into UV edit mode and select all of these, and in scale mode I'm going to set their X value to 0. Do the same for these, or just set them all to the same one. .03. Point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, point 05. Point 01. So now I'm setting it to specific X and Y coordinates. And they're long, so I'll set this to 0.1. Point 0.21. I'm not totally concerned about distortion right now, because once these are totally even, I can then just go willy-nilly with my scale tool. There. So now this is a perfect square representing a curved leg. And if I was doing this even more correctly, I might even have started out by unwrapping this before I started curving it. And then that's one thing that I don't have to worry about later. It could start out with really easy, just automatic mapping. And then it'll respect that geometry. Anyways, Jason, I hope this helps. Hope it helps everyone else too. And happy unwrapping. Again, don't go too crazy with this stuff. You guys need to ship your levels, so just do quick unwraps and make sure there's something on there texture-wise so that you can move forward.